Hello everyone, my name is Roy, and in today's recording we'll be exploring the differences between REST APIs and GraphQL APIs by GraphQL-izing a popular REST API called JSONPlaceholder. And by doing so, we'll be looking at differences like overfetching and also underfetching called the N+1 problem. For this, as I said, we'll be GraphQL-izing a popular REST API. In this scenario, it is JSONPlaceholder, which is a free API you can use for testing and prototyping. It's all based on open source and it has some generous sponsors that are actually making this tool possible. Also, it gives you a set of API endpoints that you can already use, such as API endpoints to get posts, to get comments, and all these things also have relationships with each other. You have the possibility to use pod params, query parameters, all these kinds of things. What we're using today is the endpoint to get posts. If I click on this, I get the endpoint to actually be called already, and I get an array back of something with posts. So this is quite some data. It's 100 records that all of the fields user ID, title, and body. And to actually look at the differences between this REST API endpoint and a GraphQL API, we'll be GraphQL-izing this endpoint using StepZen. And more specifically, we'll be using the StepZen import command StepZen import curl. And with StepZen import curl, you can import any REST API endpoint just by using a curl request. For this, I've set up a VS Code project in which I can just run StepZen. Well, first, of course, you need to make sure you have the StepZen CLI installed, which you can do by running npm install globally and then run StepZen. So this will install the StepZen CLI globally, which I've already done, of course. So now the next thing I need to do is running the StepZen import curl command. StepZen import curl. I copy paste the REST API endpoint for posts, and then I do some other modification. So I want to set a name to the folder that will be created that contains the GraphQL schema of this REST API endpoint. So I will put this as JSON placeholder. Then I will need to set a query type. So this is the type that will be returned. I can do post. And then I can also set the query name, which I can do get all posts, because what this query will be doing is getting all the posts using the REST API endpoint from JSONPlaceholder. I just press enter and StepZen will start working. So it will probably ask me what I'd like to name my endpoint, as it does right now. So I can call this API slash JSON placeholder. Try this. And then it starts importing my endpoint. And of course, you can either sign up with a StepZen account to have this located in your StepZen account, or you can use the CLI without having an account, which is also perfectly fine. In this case, just don't run the StepZen login command. So it has created a GraphQL schema for me with a query called getAllPost, which will call the post endpoint. And then it also created some other configuration files. So the only thing I need to do now is run StepZen start. And this will start running my GraphQL API based on the REST API from JSONPlaceholder. In here it will ask me whether I want to sign in or not. Of course, I haven't signed in yet, so I can just continue without logging in, which will make my endpoint public. So this is important to understand. Of course, JSONPlaceholder is already a free and public API, so it doesn't really matter. So we can continue with it logging in, and it will deploy my endpoint to a public account. And it also says my API endpoint can be found here. So what I will do, I will just go to my browser. And on this new tab, I will insert this GraphQL endpoint, which will bring me to a graphical which contains my query. In this example, query to get all the different posts based on the get post endpoint. What will I do? I will just run get posts and just start inserting all these fields. So we have ID, we have user ID, we have body, and we also have title. Let's do title above the body, because that's usually what happens. And this will get all the data that's coming from the REST API endpoint that you can see here. But typically, as you're developing an application, you don't need all this data. Because if we will be opening the browser tab, let's try and do that. So let's go to the browser tab, go to network. and then just resend this query again, you can see this request has been sent to the GraphQL API. You can also see the size, 27 kilobytes. And if we click on it, we can even see more. So we can see how much time it took to do the request, which isn't that much. And we can also find the size of the request. Maybe we can find it here. Now we probably need to find it here. So 27 kilobytes of resources being sent. But the only thing we actually need maybe is just an ID and a body. So we can resend the query. And now you can see it's actually way smaller. So instead of 27 kilobytes, it's now only 8 kilobytes being transferred. So this is what we call overfetching in GraphQL, because you're overfetching data from the REST API endpoint if you're using just REST. So with GraphQL, you're not overfetching because you only request the types and data fields you need. So we can still insert the body in example, and then the amount of data will be more. It will be 27 kilobytes again. So if you just need the ID in the title, you'll be actually overfetching if you use the REST API endpoint, because the REST API endpoint will give you all this data every single time you send a request. So this is something simple called overfetching in GraphQL. It's not really simple because of course you need to understand REST APIs and GraphQL APIs to see the difference, but this is the main reason I really like GraphQL. You only get the data you actually need. So this is overfetching, and then there's something else called underfetching. With underfetching, you don't get all the data you need, so you need to send a second REST API endpoint request. So let's try it out here. So let's go to a post. Let's go to post with ID 1. In here you can see we're getting data for this post, but we're not getting the user data. And something we want actually is also the user data. So what can you do? With this endpoint from JSONPlaceholder, you can also get user information from users. So this is my user with ID 1 that is linked to this post. And typically when I want to fill my UI, I want to have both data fields. So I want to have data about my user, but also about my post. So what I need to do then is send two different requests. I will need to send a request to the post endpoint, and then a request to this endpoint which will give me the user info, which is two requests instead of one. With GraphQL, you can actually bring this together in one single request. And for this, we will need to make some changes to our query. To the query that is defined in our schema. So let's also import this user. For this again, we'll be using StepZen import curl. We're running StepZen import curl. We'll be pasting this thing. Again, we'll be sending a name. So we can do name, we can say users. We can do a query type. Let's use the double dash there. Say this is user. We can say the query name. Maybe just get user by ID. And then the most important thing we need to do here is specify the pet params, meaning the parameters that will be used to find out which user is being loaded. So what we can do here is go for /users/ insert ID there, and then close it like this. So this will import this REST API endpoint and create a new file. Oh, let's see, I've done something wrong. Oh, too many dashes. Try it again. It should actually work. This has imported a user's API endpoint. It has created types for all the different response types. And as you can see, it's a bit more because the JSON of the user's endpoint was a nested JSON. And then using the pet parameters, which you can see here, we actually have a query parameter specified in GraphQL by just adding this flag to the CLI. And then if I would be starting my GraphQL server again by running StepZen start, which will not only start the GraphQL server, it will also deploy my new schema to the cloud. The GraphQL interface becomes available again and we can query the user by its ID. So to give you an idea what would happen if you were working with pure REST, you would need to send a request to get the ID, the title, and then probably also the user ID. And then you would need to send a second request to also get the user. Oh wait, let me refresh this. So you need to send a second request to get the user by ID. You would need to specify an ID. You would say maybe that's 1. And then you need to specify all the fields that you want. So maybe it's name, maybe it's email. Then you can do it like this. You will get all the post information and you will get the user information. But of course, let's imagine you have all these different requests. So we have 100 posts. So for 100 posts, you will need to get the user for every single post, which can be quite, so imagine having this request to get all the single posts from JSONPlaceholder. And then for every user ID, so often it's 1, sometimes it's also 2, you need to set individual requests to the REST API to get the user information. With GraphQL, this is something you no longer have to do. So instead of having to send separate queries, we'll be making it so you only need to send one query. So we would want to have this query, get user, name, and email. So this way the user will be retrieved for every single user that is defined in our post. For this we need to use StepZen with the materializer. So what we can do here, we can say user. We set the response type of user to be user. And then we'll be using, somehow it's really working with me. Just neglect it, start a new rule. And we'll be using a custom directive called appMaterializer, which you can use to combine data from different queries into one response. What we want to do here is get the user by ID query, which we just created, set the arguments of ID to be user ID, which we'll retrieve here. So as soon as I press save, this new schema will be published in the cloud. As you can see here, it will be deployed to StepZen. And if I go to my GraphQL interface, I can actually refresh this. Let's refresh it. And I should be able to send this query that will get all the information from my post and also from the users, as you can see. So for every single request, for every single post, it will also get the user. And of course, we do smart things because user ID, when it's the same, we only do the request for you once. While typically with REST, the request will be sent an infinite amount of time. So this is what we call underfetching, or the N+1 problem. And with GraphQL, you only need to send one request instead of a lot of different requests to get all the data that you need. And of course, this is just one of the few smart things you can do with StepZen. So I really advise you to head over to stepzen.com/getting-started to figure out how to get started with StepZen with your favorite data source. Because using StepZen, you can actually use all sorts of different data sources. If you would be going to stepzen.com/getting-started, you can actually find all these different data sources that you can use together with your project. So in here you can find information about installing the CLI and also about using StepZen with your favorite data sources, such as SQL, NoSQL, REST APIs we just done, maybe GraphQL APIs or even SOAP. So subscribe to this video to stay in touch with us, or head over to Twitter and find more information about what we're doing at StepZen. And with this, I'd like to end this video and I hope to see you again soon.